Well, exactly this, yeah. So exactly what I'm showing you here. So the previous one was a knockout, and so we actually changed the genetic makeup of this mouse, and we saw that that actually makes the mom mouse look depressed, and she doesn't care for her infants. But here, what we're doing is we're doing some kind of a human disruption here. And so we're changing the environment of the mouse. This mouse is a different mouse than those other ones. The mother doesn't have the knockout there. And so her question was sort of what in the environment might contribute to this. And in fact, this is an example of what might happen in the environment. That adequate care of this mouse inadequate care of the mouse disrupts the system so dramatically that in adulthood they still have an altered neurobiological stress system. They are responding to stressors in a much more direct way, and they have difficulty shutting down that stress system. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes?
Does that relate anyway to adoption? I'm wondering, like, I have 2 adopted children. One was in the foster home till she was 11 weeks, and then at that point, her environment was altered.
Yes.
You know, from the foster home to permanent. My other one was 6 weeks, so I'm just wondering how that might play.
Yes. A very good question. So we have this. In mice, we know, because they've done lots of studies, and we know that actually if you take the mouse away at day 12 to 14 and do the same thing, it actually doesn't alter their stress system. Okay? So that we do all these experiments with mice, and we know exactly what days you need to disrupt their development and what the outcome is going to be probabilistically. Not every mouse has that outcome. But your question has to do with humans. And your question really has to do with when is this period of plasticity and this sensitive window. Okay, so I was asking you to remember those 2 principles. And we don't know. We don't know specifically. We do know that disruption in the early childhood of a child has some effects. But we don't know. We know that they're also malleable. They're plastic, and those systems can recuperate some of those losses. In fact, with adoption studies, you're probably familiar with some of the work. They found that kids in deprived orphanages in Romania actually quit growing. And we'll bring up some of those issues about the stress system later. And they quit growing, but when they're adopted, they often do this catch-up, and they grow tremendously when they're in a nurturing environment. And so we know that there are ways that our system recoups some of those losses. We don't have the studies that show exactly when this system would close those windows of plasticity. But our idea is that as long as the child is developing, probably into late adolescent, early adulthood, we still have a window of time that these systems are still malleable and are plastic. That doesn't say that those early traumas might not have some long-term effects, yeah. Whether this disruption to the stress system is genetic or environmental, we actually can change our DNA. Now, not DNA in that regular way, so our genetics. It has to do with this turning on and shutting off of our DNA. So we're going to pass on our DNA to our offspring, just like we always thought we were going to do. But what we have been learning now is that there are windows in which there's a time when our DNA becomes turned on or turned off. So what is passed on may be altered. And the studies with mice are really an exciting area of research. Probably somebody's going to win the Nobel Prize for this mouse type of research because they found that during these developmental periods where things are changing tremendously, this is also the opportunity when the DNA is most likely to be altered in the mouse. And so we see what we call epigenetic effects, or genome turns on and turns off. And I don't have enough time to really go into this adequately, but what I would want you to take away from that is that your question about environment, in fact, environmental traumas or disruptions can change what we end up passing on to our offspring, because those systems are altered through our experience, in fact. So what we see in our current models so I want you to take away with those three sort of ideas. First of all, plasticity, sensitive periods, and then the idea of how we might apply some of this research in animals to humans, because we examine them quite differently. So the neurobiological stress system is associated with depression. These two aspects that we've just been talking about, the brain and the hormonal stress system, are intricately tied with depression. Some of our work in our laboratory has shown, we've done pictures of the brain of adolescents who are depressed and are well, and this shows that the connections between the more regulatory parts of the brain, the cingulate, which is actually between the frontal lobe and the limbic lobe, and the amygdala have less efficient connections. That white matter is less efficient in adolescents that are depressed. And we've also shown that adolescents with depression have less connectivity, so that limbic area of the brain, that response to stress, is less connected with those frontal regulatory control areas. And so here you can see that the orange of the controls represents the patterns of connections. We do this through what we call resting state fMRI. So just when they're at rest, where are there strong patterns of connections between their brains, and how do we map the brain in that way? And we see that there's a lot of connections between that deep center part of the brain, the limbic lobe, and the frontal regulatory control regions. But you look on the depressed adolescent, and there's very few. This actually would look more like a younger child, the connections, because the depressed adolescent would look like they hadn't matured adequately, that they hadn't formed these connections. We also do functional MRI, so we ask them to do various tasks in the scanner. They have shown that showing you faces of fear activates your amygdala, your threat system. You see somebody else scared and you think, oh, there is a reason that I should be afraid. And so it activates your stress system. And what we find with our depressed adolescents is that it does activate their stress system, but it activates their stress system much more than our children, our adolescents that are not struggling with depression. And so they have a hyper-arousal to stress in the brain. This actually plays out with their physiological stress system in a number of important ways. One is that it increases our hormonal activity in our body, and it also interferes with our shutoff valve, so that when the stressor has passed, there's no bear, cortisol continues to be secreted in the body. Now, why would this be important? I'm going to give you a little break on our brain neurology. We'll take a little segue here. This is my ad for Robert Sapolsky. I was just at Stanford, and I am such a Robert Sapolsky groupie that I would have loved to have gone in and chatted with him. Why zebras don't get ulcers. Now we're starting to talk about the stress system and the responses of the stress system. He is an expert on the stress system. And when we mobilize our bodies for stress, there are a number of repercussions that are relevant to depression, but they're relevant to almost every kind of problem we could think of. So when we have a stressor, the bear, we mobilize energy. Glucose. We need glucose to get away, so we have quick energy to get away. It raises our heart rate, our blood pressure. It slows digestion. In fact, you've heard people say, I was so scared I peed my pants, right? Gets rid of things like you don't need that urine in your bladder anymore. You need to be able to get out of there. And so that's that system, that reflex of getting rid of what we don't really need to get away. It slows growth, like that example of this woman back here that was asking about the adoption, right? It slows growth. If we're really stressed, we're threatened, we don't need to spend our energy growing. We just need to spend our energy surviving. It slows reproduction. We're really learning a lot about this process of reproduction slowing because we know so much about infertility now and how, in fact, stress has an important role to play with infertility. Because, in fact, if you're trying to survive and just make it to live, why would you be able to be fertile? Because that would take energy to nurture the next generation. It blunts pain, speeds up aging, and suppresses immune function. I have a really nice video that I show my undergraduates. They have these experiments where they make you have blisters on your arm. People that have been willing to be blistered, they give you some blisters on your arm. They measure your stress response, and people that are highly stressed take longer to heal those blisters than people that are low in stress. Yes? Yes. Yeah, right. They say, well, yes. There's actually a lot of ways it speeds up aging. But some of it has to do with this neurotoxicity effect that I'm going to talk about. So that's a complex question. They say, one term in office is around 10 years of aging, right? A decade of aging. And I believe it. There are numerous ways that this stress system increases aging, but I'm going to just talk about one. And it really has to do with this idea of the body repairing itself. And so what we see is that not only is the stress system important for depression, it's important for almost every kind of problem that somebody might experience. Cancer, diabetes, all of these systems are influenced by stress. The question remains, why don't zebras get ulcers? It's because they don't keep that stress around. As soon as they see a threat, they respond to it. It dispels their glucose, their energy. It has all these adaptive functions. It mobilizes them. They run away from the stressor, and their stress comes down immediately. What happens with our systems are that we are worrying. We are worrying. We keep those stressors with us. We don't always exercise to dispel our glucose when we're worrying the most. And so, in fact, we accumulate these stressors. So that, in fact, is why zebras don't get ulcers. And, in fact, this is similar with the depressed adults. This is a Trier social stress test, that test that I told you about, giving a talk and doing mental arithmetic or some similar thing. And we see that with depressed adults, they respond to stressors like typical people without depression do. But what happens is that their stressor continues to activate even when the stressor is gone. They don't return to baseline. We've seen that similar kinds of, I'm going to actually just skip through a couple of them because I'm running a little late. We see that similar kinds of things occur with adolescents. In some of our work, we gave adolescents the Trier social stress test, and we found that adolescents with depression and other types of mood problems, they activate to the stressors, but their stress system doesn't turn off as quickly as people that are not suffering from depression or anxiety. And so what we have seen is that this turning off of the system is really important. This regulatory system is important, both in terms of the brain regulatory patterns and also the stress hormonal regulatory problems. So let's get to our last question of the day, because I want to leave some time for more discussions. How do these advances provide hope for effectively intervening? And here, again, we're going to use an example of adolescence. Well, major depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide. It's ranked third as a global burden of impairment of disease. It interferes with our global economy, and it's the third leading cause. The onset is common in adolescence, and an early onset in adolescence carries a particularly poor prognosis. You have increased risks for morbidity and mortality, so other problems and also for death. And so there is particular interest, and our group has been focusing on this question more specifically on focusing on adolescence. There's growing interest in addressing the problem early in the disease course. We do believe that adolescence is still a period where there is brain plasticity. The evidence suggests that is the case. We also believe that it potentially is this window of opportunity, that if we intervene early, those negative long-term effects may be mitigated. And so if we intervene prior to maturity, potentially some of these long-term detrimental effects could be averted. We have effective treatments for adolescents with depression. We have cognitive behavioral therapy. In fact, mild depression only needs psychoeducation or supportive therapy. If you have moderate levels of depression, cognitive behavioral therapy and interpersonal therapy, both well-validated treatments, are used effectively. And if you have severe or moderately severe depression in adolescence, we know that medication and a combination of medication and psychotherapy are effective treatments. So we have all of our answers to this problem. We have effective treatments. Well, not quite. Because, in fact, the TAD study was one of the most comprehensive studies on adolescent depression, and we saw that CBT was slightly more effective than placebo. Fluoxetine, or Prozac, was also more effective than placebo, and the combination was more effective. But we saw a similar kind of pattern with IPT, or interpersonal therapy, and treatment as usual. But what this doesn't tell us is that story about who doesn't respond, because we know that there are some that respond and some that don't respond. In fact, 30% of adolescents often don't respond to these empirically validated treatments that are available for use. And if we drop that down to the window of CBT, we would have 40 to 50% of adolescents that are not responding to cognitive behavioral therapy. So what do? We just say, oh, great, well, we have a treatment that's available and useful for some of our adolescents that are depressed, and we won't worry about those others. If they're on your client list, they're your daughter, your son, those people that are not responding are really important to figure out what to do. And this is where some of our work has been taking us recently. Personalized interventions may be one of the approaches that can be useful. In fact, trying to understand more specifically who responds to treatment and who doesn't respond to treatment will be important. What if you were an adolescent You weren't quite sure if cognitive behavioral therapy was going to work, but your mom said, well, there's evidence to suggest it was going to work, and so you signed up for cognitive behavioral therapy. Maybe you even went through a 3 or 6 months trial of cognitive behavioral therapists with a really, really good cognitive behavioral therapist, and you didn't show any symptom improvement. That would be really discouraging. In fact, you might think that mental health professionals had nothing to offer you, and you might be disillusioned with the system and not try something else. Wouldn't it be better if we could identify what factors are important to predict treatment response? And that's where this idea of personalized medicine comes into play. Wouldn't it be great if we knew there are some types of depression that respond to CBT, some that respond to medication, some that respond to IPT, before you already go through a whole trial and fail out of the trial, basically? And so that's where we are starting to look for some of our answers. They've had relatively moderate success in terms of thinking about psychosocial variables that will predict treatment response. The one that does seem to come out pretty regularly is people that have more severe depressions do benefit to some degree with treatment. Oops, I'm not quite ready for that. What we have started to look at, and I think maybe I gave you a slide or two of that, is this idea of identifying neurobiological pathways, understanding the stress system and how they map onto treatment effects. So thinking about if you have a regular stress reactivity pattern like I've talked to you about with depression, one that elevates and maintains arousal even when the stressor is gone, would you respond to medication better than cognitive behavioral therapy, or potentially cognitive behavioral therapy better than medication? And I think the last slide I have in your handout, although I don't have it up here, is this idea that there may be different systems that we're activating. Okay, so cognitive behavioral therapy works on problem solving and helping you with planning and strategies. And it actually influences the frontal lobe, providing frontal regulatory control of the limbic system. However, medication, we call that a top-down process. From the frontal lobe, we're starting to control the limbic system, that threat system. Medication may have the opposite effect. It may decrease our amygdala from firing quite so dramatically when there's a threat. Of course, we don't want it to shut off the amygdala altogether because it's useful, but we want it maybe to dampen, because maybe adolescents that are depressed don't need to be always thinking that everything is a threat. And so dampening that threat system and requiring less from that frontal regulatory control. We call that a bottom-up system. So together, those processes may interact to impact the neurobiology of the brain. Helen Mayberg, a researcher in adult depression, is actually doing these studies currently, and our lab is starting to look at downward extensions. So trying to look at the brain to see what alterations are taking place as a result of cognitive behavioral therapy. You would think that having an experience like learning new strategies wouldn't change the brain, but in fact it does dramatically change the brain. And we actually have some pilot data showing that exact effect, so that people don't respond. They change their neural networks. Okay, I think I'll stop there and take some questions. Yes?
If you could wait until I get the microphone to you, that would be helpful.
Okay. So this
if you could raise your hand.
Can you speak to the issue of identifying characteristics in an adolescent who's depressed that may indicate that they would be a better candidate for cognitive behavior therapy than perhaps another individual?
Well, so that's the work that's currently being done, and so I don't think we have the indicators currently well established in terms of who would be better for cognitive behavioral therapy as opposed to a different approach. I would say that we know that cognitive behavioral therapy can be effective without medication with moderate levels of depression. So if you catch somebody early in their depression, it's more likely to be effective. But these strategies in terms of personalizing care are just at the forefront of our research currently, and we don't really have established decision rules, which is what you're asking for. Who would be the best candidate for a specific type of treatment. Yeah. Do you have something to add? Yeah.
Hang on, coming.
So, thanks, Bonnie. Just to add to that, in the adult research world, there's another area of cognitive therapy that's being called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And what they focus on, it really gets to some of what you talked about, Bonnie, that there's a subset who don't shut off their stress physiology effectively enough. And, this morning I talked a little bit about sleep and nutrition, but sometimes sleep and nutrition isn't the whole picture, or even if you optimize those, the body's so hardwired to trigger stress physiology that an effective strategy, regardless of the age, because there's actually a lot of work happening in adolescence around mindfulness training, is you retrain the body to experience what no stress feels like. And that, to me, is also the promise of neuroplasticity, that yes, there are probably these critical windows that we can identify through scientific research, but when you look at the adult research, you can actually have an adult who's been struggling with PTSD or anxiety or depression for years, who, if the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy or mindfulness training is effective for them, really are able to rewire their bodies not to be so reactive, and that leads to recovery. So there's a lot of sort of intervention studies that are done that don't necessarily have randomized controlled trials or control groups, but it's really a promising area, and it is about retraining the body to shut off the cortisol response.
This microphone slows down the process. The reason I asked the question is that my clinical experience is that if you're brighter, more intelligent, that I can teach those strategies to an adolescent more effectively.
Cognitive behavioral
therapy. The
Yeah.
idea of
Yeah.
restructuring your thoughts, basically using your brain to change your mind. This is a pretty abstract concept.
Yeah.
And that, again, an older adolescent, more intelligent adolescent seems to benefit from that. This, again, that's my experience.
Yep.
That's why I asked the question.
I would agree with you that that's probably so we don't actually do cognitive behavioral therapy standardly with children under 9, and it's because they don't understand those cognitive abstractions. So we usually use behavioral therapy as what's validated for children under 9, and we do a lot of behavioral activation and exposure types of strategies with those children, and we don't typically use the cognitive piece because it does require some cognitive abilities. And I would add to your, the selling process of cognitive therapy is extremely critical, or meditation. These cognitive control strategies, the selling part, or the convincing the consumer of the importance is extremely important for these strategies, because without their buy-in, they're not going to be changing their brain structure, right, if they're not utilizing these resources.
Bonnie, could I just comment?
Mm-hmm.
There is also a third evidence-based practice called mentalization-based psychotherapy, and there was just an article in the American, I think it was American Journal of Psychiatry, that talked about a randomized control group for teen, and that speaks to this man's point. For some particularly very traumatized teens, I think the idea of how you think is a prerequisite. So you can't get to mindfulness if you don't know how to think about yourself, and you can't get to CBT if you can't think about yourself problem solving. And so that's a third option. But I think what he's raising is that we have to really look at not just the developmental age, but the developmental capacities. And since thinking about myself is such a critical component of adolescent functioning, that when you don't have that capacity, you have to start where the teen is at. And I think there's some good evidence that this is an intervention that extends some of this developmental repair. So I just want to add that. And I think it was in the last month's journal, but I'll check. Mentalization-based psychotherapy for teens.
Yeah, there are several other types of psychotherapy that are used and have evidence to suggest that they're effective. These are the CBT and the IPT are the ones that are the considered best established in terms of intervention. Yeah.
I'm interested in the relationship between these children who are raised in environments where they have these continual stressors and risk-taking behavior later in life, whether it's late adolescence or adulthood. I'm wondering if there's something that, I don't know if there's research behind this or not, but that shows that a system that is developed within this context where cortisol levels are constantly elevated, if there is kind of an intentional, like there's a deficit in that brain or in that body, that they are intentionally seeking risk-taking behaviors in later life because of that.
Yeah. So that's a really good question, because there are people that don't activate the stress. So you're bringing up some of these ideas about individual differences. And there are some people that don't activate the stress system. We've been talking about ways you overactivate the stress system and keep it turned on. There are some people that don't tend to activate the stress system and might seek more arousal because they're not activating the stress system. So most of what the stress system does is to let us know that there's a stress, we need to get rid of that stress and move on. And if your system isn't activating, then there's no signal that that we have a stressor that needs to move on. So we see that with kids with oppositional defiant disorder, particularly in the conduct disorder spectrum, they have a very low stress reactivity. So they don't arouse in response to stress, and it probably means that they have to ramp it up in order to get a stress reactivity curve, just like you were saying. There is another similar type of profile. It has to do with that drip of the piles of paper adding up. And what we now know is that there's this point of allostasis, which is similar to that idea of homeostasis that we all know about, that your body kind of returns to this set point. So you would think that people with PTSD have an hyperarousal of the stress system like people with depression. But in fact, they often have a lowering similar to these conduct disorder kids. Their stress system quits activating. And so you can come to that same pattern of low activation either from your initial physiology or environmental stimuli, so that you can, in fact, tire out your stress system from activating, and it will not rally when it's needed. And so we can come through many different directions in terms of how we tire out that system. So in fact, what we sometimes do is try to increase the stress arousal system in kids that have a low functioning system. And how might we do that? You'd think that, oh, I'm going to just stress that kid out more or give them more sensations. But no, in fact, providing them with a nurturing, structured environment actually regulates their stress system. There's some really nice studies. Phil Fisher in Oregon has done some work on adoptee and foster kids and has found that moving into a supportive family can put your stress system that was not reactive onto a normal reactivity pattern. And so, again, in childhood, I think we can make some movement in terms of normalizing these systems. we may be a little bit less optimistic in terms of when these are fully entrenched in adulthood.
Other questions?
So is the ultimate intent of this research to be able to eventually have general medical doctors, or when someone comes in for a mental health evaluation, be able to evaluate their previous stress responses to be able to use that information to be able to determine what your first course of action is going to be for treatment?
Yep, that would be the ideal. Yep. And there's Greg Siegel at Pittsburgh is doing some of that work. He actually has a study with adults that he has their brain scanned, and as part of their treatment, he's co-opted an insurance company to scan their brains prior to treatment, and selecting treatment on that basis to determine if they can do that effectively. Yeah.
Just really briefly, you talked about medication and trying to dampen the amygdala and providing just patient education. Usually we're talking about serotonin and dopamine. So can you just give a brief explanation of how to concisely convey that?
Right. So that was sort of my disclaimer at the very beginning. Remember when I had this whole system of the brain? You're right. We're only covering just such a small area of the key components of the brain. I haven't been talking about neurotransmitters. I haven't been talking about other structures of the brain that would be, critical to these processes. I haven't talked about other physiological systems like heart rate and blood pressure and all those systems too. So in terms of the neurotransmitters, they are actually intricately tied with the stress reactivity and response system. So the neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, particularly serotonin, is specifically tied to our activation of stress and our negative mood, and it's connected through some of the networks in terms of other neuroproteins like BDNF and protective hormones as well. So what I wanted to do is kind of focus on these areas, not discounting the other areas, but just simplifying the picture, because it ends up being an extremely complicated picture. We have things like BDNF that actually increase our resilience to these neurotoxic effects, and other things that I didn't mention is that we see that these brain systems have ongoing neurotoxic effects on the system, and so those would be important to consider too. Yeah.
I'd like you to go back to the rodent research when you were talking about the little baby mice who got taken away from the mother for a short period of time. What are you thinking about that in terms of maternity leaves and that kind of stuff as we apply it to humans?
Yeah. Well, academics have such a biased picture, right? I don't do research in that particular area of childcare, but if you were home with your baby, you probably weren't an academic doing research in that area. And so what we know about the stress system and activating the stress system in infants is that there's lots of ways we do through separation normally in our lives, activate that stress system. I would say that the research has not focused or accentuated that aspect because, like I said, we have a biased group of people that typically do that type of research. So typically what has been looked at is sort of the quality of care, and usually when you see a high quality care, you don't see as disruptions in these stress systems. And so Yeah,
You just simply picked them up,
yeah,
and for a short period of time.
yeah,
And it was that disruptive.
yeah.
And
I
so
think
that really concerned me when I saw that.
Yeah, I think it is concerning. I mean, I think it's important to use animal research in the context of animal research. Like, we know a lot about these specific days and the specific times. We do think that humans are more adaptive to their life circumstances, and that they have a larger window of a sensitive period, and so that those systems may not be sort of quite as specifically tied to the problematic effects. But I agree with you completely. I mean, we know a lot of children are treated much more poorly than, we use these paradigms for mice, and we know that they must have some types of long-term effects on those problems. We don't really know. I mean, we do see that infants do activate their stress system when they're separated from their parents, and so we do think that this parental bond or the caretaking bond is important, not only in mice but in humans, in terms of activating the stress system. We don't have any evidence to show that it shows those long-term negative effects, at this point. So. Good question, though. Yeah.
Other questions? Okay. Do you have closing remarks, Bonnie?
I really don't. I just, I hope I haven't discouraged you from understanding, thinking about this important area of research and topic, and I hope some of it was applicable to thinking about your own stress neurobiology as well. So please come back. Not as much of the neurobiology will be covered, and much more practical applications will be covered in my colleagues' speeches.
Thank you.